Hey everyone, Ryan here at Plague Scythe Studios. Welcome to an awkwardly framed gear curiosity. We are checking out my latest rack-based pedal drawer build that I'm dubbing Tube Amp Mission Control. This video could have turned out to be a lot of things. In fact, I almost made this into kind of a build vlog series like I've done in the past with some guitar mods and even a PC build at one time. But this went over a few iterations within the past 3 months or so, and frankly, I was not feeling dealing with all that footage and editing and making something that was coherent to watch, and generally those kind of series don't do amazing as is. So scrap that idea. I almost made this like a hardware tutorial. This will kind of flow like a tutorial, I think, but frankly, I don't expect any one of you out there to replicate this exact setup. What I do hope you get out of it is seeing how I went about solving some of my own workflow problems when it comes to recording or even simply playing with analog gear and making it pair better with other stuff. That's among the problems I try to solve here. And there's a lot of things here that you'll see this isn't necessarily the most cost-efficient way to go about this. This is certainly not the most space-efficient way to go about this. But between that and what I already owned, I think this is a really great compromise of all of those angles, because aside from, let's see, that guy, I did end up buying that power supply, could have gotten by with something else, and this 1U patch bay, that's pretty much all I have in it, and custom length cables, which admittedly cost way too much. So they're stupidly priced, but hey, I paid for it for convenience. So everything else was already kind of there, and I just put it together in a fashion that works for me. And my tertiary objective of sorts, as is with a lot of my videos, is kind of show manufacturers what maybe some consumers out there are looking for, because frankly, if there was a 2 or even 3U rack unit like this that did all this stuff already, I would have gladly sold off some of this stuff and just gone with that for convenience sake. And given my, kind of lack of space efficiency in some areas, I think that would be very doable. So I guess I should start off, what is this exactly? You'll probably recognize a lot of the components and pedals we're using here, but as a whole, what I'm trying to do here is basically make tube amp recording way easier, way more convenient, because whether I was plugging straight in or if I was using, external overdrive pedals, or especially if I was reamping, it was always this cacophony of black spaghetti and, various speaker cables and instrument cables, having to drag out power supplies, having to move different stuff around, and it would just become a mess in here. And so I was like, you know what, let's put together something that with a touch of a few buttons, with a couple instances of rerouting cables, everything's ready to go. So no matter what I want to do with a tube amp, whether I'm playing silently, or I want to play through real cabinets, or I want to pair this with post effects or pre-effects, or if I don't want to do any of that stuff, it doesn't matter. I can still have the ability to do that as well. So I think you'll get the idea once we go through the entire signal chain. There's essentially 3 main components of this little setup, and well, technically 4 if you count the power supply, though I do hope to expand this later down the road. We'll go over some of those improvements later in the video. But we've got a 2U kind of pedal drawer. This is really just like a utility shelf. They're like 15 bucks or something like that online. I think this is a rose wheel, bottom of the barrel, but you can do anything with it if you want to drill holes or Velcro it up. We've got a 1U patch bay. This is a ProCraft 1U thing that they sell. It already was pre-drilled, so you can put whatever you want in it, whether it's XLR, combo jacks, and it'll fit. I've just got these pass-through 1/4 inch jacks, since everything I'm doing today will be using these 1/4 inch cables. We also have a power amp, courtesy of the Matrix GT1000 effects. That is a solid state stereo power amp. And then of course power with the Furman M8X squared 2, whatever that's actually called. And of course that powers everything you see here. Tube amps, as well as any external effects if I want to plug a pedal board up front, which I'm doing right now. Now, a lot of the toys that are up here on this pedal drawer thing are definitely awesome, but the real star of the show here is definitely this patch bay, because this allows everything to have a home, which is half of what makes me excited for this setup, because I don't have to move any of this crap anymore. And this always ensures that no matter which part we're talking about, it always has a cable, a connection going to it. So all you got to do is plug something into it or from it. So that saves all kinds of headaches. You know where it's going to or where it's coming from. And a lot of these things, as you see, you can just take a simple jumper and continue your signal chain, which is, half of what I wanted to do anyway. But if I don't want to, you still have the ability to put stuff in between or skip it altogether. So let's start with the beginning. Over here, we've got an input. All of these labels, by the way, I do plan to make official, but I'm not entirely sure this is how this will look by the final revision of this thing. I would call this beta 0.5 at best, and you'll see why as we go along. But you start with the input. This is where you would put your regular guitar signal in. So if I just wanted to jam out through a tube amplifier, or I wanted to dial in a tone for recording or making a demo, then that's what I would do. Take my guitar of choice, plug that in, and I'm ready to rock. But one of the major inconveniences I wanted to solve with this setup was reamping, because I do it a lot for this channel, and even recording with tube amps in general. And the last thing I wanted to do was go through the effort of all of this and then still have to drag out a reamp box, still have a cable running somewhere, and I just wanted it to be there ready to go at all times. Now, the way my interface is set up, I always have a signal running to the reamp box, and when I'm using Cubase, it's not a problem because it always has its independent DI output through, I think, output 3. So it only gets fed signal when I route something to that, and I have to specifically do that, so it's all good. But when I'm using Windows, any operating system use case, whether I'm watching videos, playing games, it's being fed, I guess, the left channel of the regular stereo output, and I don't want that. I don't want to, bombard this thing with signal that it doesn't need. And I certainly don't want it to pass through all kinds of gear that it's not really meant to process that. It's not like it should hurt it, but if you don't have to, abuse it, there's no sense in doing that. So I wanted to have something that you can either play a guitar through or reamp through, and that's where we have this little doohickey up here. So this is a JHS summing unit. This actually takes 2 inputs and then combines them together. And you can use this for all sorts of things. This is like the easiest use case possible. But basically what I'm doing is taking the guitar input, routing it to here, and I'm taking the reamp box input and routing it to there as well. And that allows me to achieve the same sound with the exact same setup, whether I want to use a live guitar or play pre-recorded DIs. And I can enable and disable this leg of the signal chain with this on-off switch back here, which admittedly is a piece of garbage. It has terrible reviews, but what I'd like to do long term is maybe drill out an on-off switch here and have that dictate what's going on up here. But there was nothing else that was that simple or cheap, so I'm going to gamble on it for the time being, and when it does break, I'll do something about it. But even with that, it is so much easier than having to move that thing all the time. So if you don't need a reamping solution, or you don't mind just dragging out the reamp box every now and then you could skip this phase. You could skip this whole summing part. But for me, this was worth the convenience factor alone. Now this travels back over here to this Roach buffered splitter. So you might be thinking, why the hell would you sum a signal just to split it again? Well, the first leg of this splitter goes to this output labeled DI. So I mean, if you're playing a regular guitar through here, all we've done is went in, out as far as a regular signal chain is concerned, which isn't too useful by itself, but you'll see why this was done in a moment. Although it does add a buffer, which for me is a good thing in the way that I generally use pedals. But the second leg of this buffered splitter goes to the key input of a Fortin Zool noise gate, which is great because this is what lets the Zool really come to life and makes it in my opinion, the best noise gate on the market, which I hate to say because it costs so much money, but it really does work wonders when you use it that way. So what you're supposed to do is run basically a DI signal into the Zool key input, which is what we're doing, and it takes that DI and says, okay, when you're playing guitar, we'll let the gate open, and when you're not, when it falls below this threshold, we'll close it. And if you run the Zool within, say, the effects loop of your amplifier, it doesn't matter how much you overdrive the front of your amp. It doesn't matter if you stack 15 distortion pedals. It only cares about what's going on in the DI, which is awesome. Now, admittedly, if Mike Fortin had put a output on the other side, we could have skipped this part altogether and just ran the output to DI, but it actually worked out considering the way this pedal board's laid out. And the other good thing about the Roach is that it does take up to 24 volts of power supply, which is cool because this actually doesn't matter. You could switch this between 18 and 9 volts, but one of the power supplies I was considering, I wouldn't have had that option, so this was like a good thing to not have to worry about. And in my case, not a big deal considering we're still using 9 volts before we even get to the buffer, but hey, more headroom is more headroom as far as I'm concerned, and it ain't gonna hurt anything. We'll come back to the Zool in a moment because in this part of the signal chain, it's not really doing anything, but coming out from the DI, this is where you'll take the raw signal to the tube amp of choice. And of course you can go straight through an amp. So if I'm doing 6-string work on a Mesa Mark IV, I'll probably go straight to it. If I'm doing extended range guitar work, then I'll use my favorite EQ or overdrive. If I'm using the clean channel, then you can throw a compressor and a clean boost in front of it. So whatever you would normally have in front of your amp would go after this DI, and then it goes into the amplifier. So pretty simple stuff there. Now, the speaker output of the amplifier, which you would normally plug into a cabinet, actually plugs into this torpedo captor, which is an 8 ohm load box attenuator and speaker sim all in one, though the only thing we're going to be using it as is basically a load box. And this entirely replaces a speaker cabinet in your signal chain. Because this is a reactive load box, it actually forces a tube power amp to react in the same way that it would with most conventional speaker cabinets. So you get that lovely little bump in the low end and that scoop in the low mids and rounding out on the high and high mids, and you get that tube amp sound. Of course, the way I have it configured, we have the dry output, and this doesn't have any speaker cabinet emulation on it. This is just your raw amp sound, which is what I want. Now, admittedly, there are more capable products there, out there on the market now with like the Fractal X Load. The Boss Waza tube expander has multiple versions of its reactive load boxes. So, you can make it sound more like a V30 or react more like a greenback or what have you. And then they've got different wattages and that sort of thing. But for the speakers that I generally record with, this actually sounds damn near identical when you pair it with the corresponding impulse response. So this sounds pretty much like a V30 or T75 or 65 creamback, anything in that like 50 to 80 watt range. This mimics really well. Now I have the Dryline Output running into here, labeled raw, and that is just an extension cable of this essentially. So from here, you can do a lot of things with it. This is already pretty capable. So, you can run this into an impulse response loader. You can run it straight into an audio interface and load impulse responses in your DAW. And it's like playing through a raw tube amp, which is cool. That's not a bad sound, but it's not really taking advantage of the whole setup. So what I will generally do is patch raw over into this input called Effects In. And Effects In runs into, you guessed it, the input of the Fortin Zool. So now we have a post noise gate on everything. And this is kind of neat because this almost treats, this tube amp as an amplifier block in an amp modeler. It doesn't just clamp the preamp, it clamps everything. So it doesn't matter what noise you're getting from the amplifier as a whole, it shuts it off. And again, because it only cares about what's happening at the DI level, It doesn't matter how overdriven or how clean, how crunchy edge of breakup your amp is dialed in to be, it will work, and it doesn't kill sustain. It's just a really great setup in this way. It also has a switchable like line level to where it can handle both DIs as well as this kind of this application we're doing here. So this has been a lifesaver in all sorts of recording applications. The output of the Zool then runs into this JHS buffered splitter. Now this pedal has an equally easy job compared to the summing amp, but in the opposite order. So it takes one signal and then splits it into two identical signals of the same level. And that runs into our output left and output right. There's a few reasons I wanted to do that, because there are several applications where I only need one output. Say we wanted to do that same thing, running this to an impulse response loader or running it straight to your audio interface, recording mono, that works fine. You just take one of these and you're golden, and you have the noise gate action on top of that. But there's plenty of times where you'll want to run into stereo effects, true stereo effects at that. Maybe you don't have to, say with like the Moore Ocean machine, it does have a mono left in and then it still splits the stereo, but there's plenty of things that don't do that. So it is nice to have both of those. But admittedly, this was not going to be the pedal that was going to sit there. I'd tried a couple revisions of this, and it turned out well because this actually does fit better, given some of the other cables. But what I was initially going to use, if I can not knock over every pedal here, is the TC Electronic Mimic. For those of you that didn't catch my review of this pedal, this is a double tracking emulator, and man, does it do an impressive job. I went as far as to compare it to an actual double tracked passage, and the only thing it's missing is just a touch of stereo depth, where the effect, the wet channel, sounds like it's panned maybe 70% instead of 100%. But in a live use case or for tracking demos, this is so convincing and is a great way to get a really quick double track sound. I've demoed it with two separate mono amplifiers, sounded great. I put it through the effects return of two amplifiers, putting an actual preamp sound through it. It sounded identical. Didn't have any color or anything like that. Just sounded double tracked. I even put it in the effects return of an amp modeler after a completely processed signal. So cabinet sound and all, and it sounds awesome. What I did not test though was putting it after a raw output from a load box, putting an entire tube power amp sound through it. And when you do that, it sounds weird. I'm not quite sure why, but it sounds like there's a significant amount of high frequency roll off. And the only thing I can really come up with is there's either a low pass filter that for some reason isn't noticeable when just using a preamp sound, or even a guitar modeler where maybe, I have a 10,000 hertz low pass anyhow, but I'm willing to bet that it's more of an impedance issue, because, stuff like the AX8 and even some of these effects loops kind of handle regular stomp boxes better. So maybe that's the case. Either way, I ended up taking this out of that position because this would have given a regular dry stereo sound as well when it's true bypassed. But when using that way, it didn't sound awesome. So I prefer to just take this and use this as, still my DI creation tool. And what I found anyway is that when using this pedal especially, but generally I prefer quad track sounds to use two separate amplifiers. They always sound better to my ears. The differences in the amps as well as the differences in the DIs always fill out those sonic gaps and more effectively. Sounds richer, fuller, all that kind of stuff. So having the same amplifier double tracked really wasn't a great idea now that I look back on it. But because we have stereo outputs, or even if you just wanted to run one in here, you could absolutely take that and run it through this pedal afterwards, even if you don't care about that low pass situation. Or what I'll probably end up doing more with this is just record demos and stick this in the effects loop of my AX8 and call it a day. So back to the stereo outputs. Again, you can do basically whatever you want with those. You can take that direct signal, run it to your software, and load impulse responses from there. You can put a cab IR in between them. You can put post effects either through software or with real pedals and run that anywhere you want. In this instance, I actually have this going into PAL and PAR, which stands for power amp left and power amp right. I'm not using any post effects here since it's just a simple, patch over, but I could absolutely run chorus, delay, reverb, all that stuff in between. And I'll have all this direct signal going into the inputs of my Matrix GT 1000. So what I've essentially done here is make a line level wet dry wet rig without the dry part, because this is the dry part. And then I have the entire signal going into whatever stereo cabs I want. So if I hook up, these two cabinets or even one stereo cabinet, now I can have independent, ping pong delay or different modulation effects that will take advantage of that stereo signal path and get a huge sound in the room if I just want to play with that, with using the instrument input. Or if I want to reamp and actually mic up a cabinet, I can do that as well. And the cool thing with using a load box in conjunction with a power amp is, you can still get that moving speakers, moving air type of vibe, but at lower volumes that, aren't going to completely rattle the room so bad if you are living in a situation that's a concern. And you can crank both the master volume and the channel volume on your amplifiers and get that saturated sound at a lower volume. Once again, without compressing the cabinet so bad if you're not going for that really, high-strung, high-volume speaker sound. So, whether you're playing this in the room, whether you're recording with this, I think this is a super powerful setup to have a tube-like solid-state power amp, because this is, as I've shown in shootouts, it's a Class A-B deal that really makes the speakers react in a way that is authentic. It doesn't sound like, your crappy little blackface solid state amp you grew up with. And that's just how I have this signal path ran right now. You could absolutely, mix and match the parts that you want. So if I wanted to just run my AX8 through the power amp, I'd take these two out, plug it in, you're done. If I wanted to just apply a noise gate to a DI for some reason, I could just, plug an instrument in or reamp it and take the DI over to effects in and then have that come out as an output and get rid of the load box part entirely. You could foreseeably do more stuff that I'm not even thinking of right now, but that's kind of the beauty of this patch panel, being able to have all these input output options at your disposal. And that is another big reason that I wanted to make this in the way that it is. And the way that I use it a lot of the times, you'll probably see it's like, well, you could have just saved a cable run there. Yeah, sure. But what if? What if I do want to use it this way? And now I've got to unhook a bunch of crap up here instead of just, biting the bullet on a 25, 50 cent patch cable that I got from a pawn shop. Now, all of that in and of itself is enough to make me a happy boy, but the cherry on top is without a doubt this RJM Mini Amp Gizmo. And this little guy hasn't seen a lot of action on the channel, actually, since I got it, about a year ago at this point. But I've used it more in the past month or so since I put together this little rig than I have ever since I got it, because it's just so convenient to use now. And again, for those that may not be aware of this, this basically turns MIDI signals into analog signals for old tube heads or any amplifier or anything that takes 1/4-inch TS jacks or TRS jacks to change channels or engage an effects loop, all that kind of stuff. So this is powered by the same 9-volt power supply that you would need for any pedal board setup. It has a MIDI in for being able to take commands from either, say, an audio interface if you're using this in conjunction with like backing tracks, so you could automate that if you wanted, or simple MIDI controller foot switch, whatever your rig entails. And then of course it has MIDI out and through to communicate with other stuff, but it has mainly this amplifier cable, and this is all dependent on what amp you have. And some of them are going to be interchangeable because, a lot of amps, like a rectifier, at least the 2-channel ones, it has a solo boost and it has a channel switch. That's all you got. So, a lot of these cables will be able to be interchangeable. But in my case, I wanted it to work with the Mesa Mark IV, because all the amps I use, and foreseeably any other amps I get, will be pretty simple. With like my Cherrytone, it's one channel. Everything's up front. You pick it and you're done. And I don't mind manual controls from the front face of an amp. With something like a rectifier, 2-channel rectifier. I barely ever use the clean channel, and if I do, it's one simple, flip from the back. It's not the biggest deal in the world. With a Mark Series amp though, holy shit, are there a lot of controls. So on the back alone is where you set effects loop on or off depending on what channel or if it's switched. The EQ on or off depending on which channel or if it's always on, which the way that I like to use it, it would be much easier just to switch it. You've got the channel selector, which is a rotary knob, and then you have stuff like mid-gain, harmonics, simulclass versus class A/B, and I'm pretty sure I'm forgetting something else, but I'm pretty sure that highlights my point. You don't want to be fumbling around the back of the amp with all that kind of crap going on. It's just more hassle than it's worth, and you especially don't want to do that when you're trying to play with the thing in a halfway live scenario. So this is where the amp Gizmo comes in. So basically it takes these MIDI signals and you can assign them via the front panel. So when I click 1, 2, and 3, that actually corresponds to the channel. So that will switch on the amplifier. The 4th button engages or disengages the post EQ. So, your 5-band EQ, super important for me because I don't want it on the clean channel ever. I like it on sometimes on Rhythm 2. I like it off sometimes on Rhythm 2. Depends on what I'm doing. I love it off for like this nice saturated British Marshall type lead sound. But then you throw like a boost pedal in front of it and turn on the post EQ, you get kind of a lower gain djenty thing that I adore. So having this assignable, per scene is awesome. And then 5 engages the effects loop, which in this case, I just have another round of post EQ to bring out some of those ampy frequencies for certain applications, but I could get by without that, frankly. I am missing one cable, and that would be, or at least one leg of the cable, that would be to engage or disengage simulclass to class A. I don't care. Whatever I'm using the amp as, I use that the entire time. I just leave it at AB for what I use it for. And if I'm doing like something that would require class A, I change way more settings than just that. So this is really not useful for me on a foot switch. But I mean, with all that stuff, you can do this, just by sitting here. So it's like, okay, I want lead, effects loop, EQ all on, or I want to have this combination or this combination. I can do that from here, or I could do it from a foot switch, which is great. Now, as awesome as it is just to be able to push a button and make an amplifier work, it wouldn't be too useful in a real-time scenario. So that's why you can write it depending on whatever command it's getting at that point. It will say, okay, when I'm getting this continuous controller command or whatever, then this is the combination of buttons I use. And when I get the next one, we'll write that, okay, this is the combination I use. So you can, use that with a pedal switcher, or pedal loop switcher, and have all sorts of tonal options at your convenience. Though for me, most of the time, it's just like, hurry up and get to this channel quicker. And that's good enough. In my instance, I have to use a custom cable because these Mark IV foot switch jacks tend to wear out and not work correctly. Mine doesn't, so I'm using the auxiliary 1/4-inch jacks, and that's fine. Just costs a few more bucks. So if you have any issues with that, hit up Bestronix Manufacturing. They treated me very well. So I suppose with that lecture over, it's now time to show you the power of this fully operational battle station. I'm definitely pleased with the way this little project turned out, and this rack alone has been worth its weight in gold here recently for the way I've been recording amplifiers. But in the spirit of continuous improvement, good is never good enough, and there's certainly things that I would like to improve going forward, most of which have to do more with the I/O and flexibility side more than the contents on the pedal drawer. So the first thing is this load box. It's awesome, but it's only single input, as is most any, cabinet setup or anything like that. So not necessarily its fault. But what I would like to do is have a modular system where you could select any amplifier and route it through here. And that's where something like an Ampete amp switcher would come in handy, though pretty much all their models are super overkill for everything I need them to do. Their 2x2 options, it's not powerful enough. I like the effects loop thing, but I use post effects anyway, so it's not really that convincing of a feature for me. Their 444 system, again, super overkill in most aspects, especially in the MIDI integration. But then you've got stuff that's way too underspec, so I wanted to be able to use more than 2 heads going through one virtual cabinet here. There's also the Kahayan switchers, which are the ones that I'm more interested in, but they do have a major downside in that the cabinet outputs aren't ran in parallel with any safety resistors. So if you choose the wrong one with a tube amp on, you could potentially blow the damn thing up, which is not good. The Ampete switcher doesn't let you do that, which is a nice safety feature. So you'd have to spend a little bit more money to make some dummy resistors, that kind of thing, if you want to be super secure, or just never move it and always have it routed to here. But that's one of those things where, because it's so capable, I'd want to fully take advantage of it, which would make me buy more tube heads and would make me at least have to buy one more matching cabinet to work with the Matrix, and it's just it's another Pandora's box that I don't really feel like opening. So what I'd really like is just a 4 to 6 tube head switch that all routes to this thing. And I think that's something that the industry could totally look at, and I'll talk on that more in a moment. Of course, that's a simple 1U upgrade that wouldn't, completely change the workflow too much, so it'd be all good there. But another thing that would be really nice is to implement some of these pedals in, MIDI switchable formats. Of course, it's not an absolute necessity in the way that I use a lot of these pedals. It actually wouldn't make too much sense. But still, to have some post effects that I constantly use in a similar rack drawer, and just be able to pop it out, dial in settings, and switch to it when needed would be pretty cool. But also a lot of the times I just like to have those things on the floor and be able to use them that way too. So it'd be kind of hard to decide which one would be best suited for that. And there's nothing better to me than just oh, I want to play with that today, and be able to take it and plug it in and just jam. And you can't really do that as much if you've got everything all tidy like I have here. Otherwise, besides maybe a couple additional button switches, some better labeling, just prettying everything up. None of this is Velcroed down right now. Could do that at some point. It's functional and it works really great. And with that said, again, I think there's a potential here for the guitar amplifier market. Now, I'll specifically point this towards Fractal Audio. If they made, I think they could do a 2U, but I think even a 3U would be worth the space it would take up. But I honestly think with what they've been able to cram in like the Axe-FX 2, they can make this in a 2U unit. But imagine something like this, except it has all this input-output options. It has, say, 4 amplifier inputs. It has, say, 2 control switches for each of those inputs. So you got like, 4 amps, then you've got control 1, control 2 for each one of those. That way, you could send MIDI commands, but go to analog controls with any of your tube heads. And I think 2 each is reasonable. I think that's what most people would need. And if you're using something as capable as a Mark Series amp, then that'll take up, 4 to 6 of them, and then you're set. You could use one other tube head and still be golden. But imagine all that with a pre-effect section using, say, like the Fractal Audio drive blocks, compressors, all that great stuff, and then a post-effect section that'll have their delays, reverbs, chorus, all that kind of stuff, as well as a cab block if you'd like to send it to front of house or to a audio workstation, as well as a parallel output that you can send to a power amp. But I don't think it'd be a reasonable thing to expect them to make their own power amp, but a lot of people that use Fractal processors and this kind of setup would already have one anyway, so it'd be fine. And in that way, you could totally tame your tube amp head and basically replace the drive block and Fractal processor, which again, with all this stuff we're talking about, you can do. I could send this to a Fractal unit, but it's not nearly as smooth or elegant, and look how much more space it takes. So if you could do that all in one unit, I would buy it, tell you the truth. That I would buy. I don't really need an Axe-FX 3. It does more than I need it to, but that I would be very interested in. So I'm basically asking for a Boss Waza tube expander with rack mount capability and, shove the Fractal magic in there. And they could absolutely do stuff like, integrate their X-Load technology. So being able to switch between the 2 reactive settings. And my mouth's just like literally watering thinking about that. And it'd be really cool if they could throw in some other goodies like, say, power supply output if you wanted to implement, like a rack pedal board or something. So, oh, and DI, have like a reamp input. That would be awesome. But overall, I would just love to see this concept taken by a reputable manufacturer and make something really special out of it. So in the meantime, I'm thrilled with what I have. And hopefully this will inspire at least a couple of you out there to maybe, solve a couple of your workflow problems in the same way. Again, none of this is particularly sexy except for maybe the noise gate and the amp Gizmo when it comes to tone or whatever, but I really like the way I use this. It has made life a lot easier and it makes guitar playing more enjoyable, and that's what it's all about. So that'll do it. Thank you very much for watching this episode of Gear Curiosities. We will see you next time, I suppose, with the Pod HD episode that I've been putting off. And any questions, comments, as always, please leave them down below, and we'll see you next time. Bye.